Excellent.
Well, thank you very much for your kind introduction, and it's a great pleasure to be here this evening. Because of the brightness of the lights, if some slides aren't clear or you can't see something, just ask me what the slide's showing from the back. Don't hesitate to wave your arms about. Actually, the title is really stemming the tide of food allergy, not allergies. If I knew how to stem the tide of all allergies, I'd be pretty happy. But we're starting with food allergies. We hope to work our way up. The reason I have the little boy with his finger in the dike is because I had to give a similar talk in Holland, so I thought it would be an appropriate audience, and hopefully floods won't be a problem to tolerate these substances and really to learn to distinguish between friend and foe. So that's peace. When tolerance mechanisms break down and the body starts to see its own tissues as foreign material, it sees, for example, its nervous system molecules as being foreign, multiple sclerosis arises. Or if it sees the beta cells in the pancreas that produce insulin as being foreign, it attacks the pancreas and you get type 1 diabetes, juvenile onset diabetes. I compare that to a state of civil war where there's unrest within the organism or within the nation. And finally, there's a war of aggression, as I would look at it, which is the least justifiable form, and that's usually because you're being very defensive. You start shooting at random, and that's what happens when foreign innocuous proteins like peanut protein, milk, egg, pollens come into contact with the body. The body tries to shoo them away using all sorts of chemicals, and whenever there's bullets around, there's collateral damage, and the body suffers from the inflammation that results. So this is actually what happens very schematically. We have these cells called mast cells and basophils that line our skin, our lungs, different organs of the body, and we have basophils in the blood. And here you have two antibodies, and these antibodies have been manufactured. Normally, the role of these antibodies on mast cells would be to fight parasites, but here the body starts to produce antibodies that recognize, and these are called IgE antibodies. IgG antibodies are the good guys, they fight infection. IgE antibodies are the not-so-good antibodies that were designed to fight parasites, but we start inappropriately producing IgE antibodies in allergic individuals against, let's say this is a peanut, okay, not a very convincing peanut. And what you do get is you get cross-linking of these antibodies on the surface of the cell, and the cell becomes very active or excited, and it releases inflammatory substances, these little things coming out. Histamine is the one you all know about. How many of you have hay fever in the summer? Okay, low, good heavens, yes, about 20% plus. And many of you would take antihistamines, right? That's to fight this substance that mast cells are releasing. And here you would substitute the peanut with a piece of grass pollen or molecules of grass pollen that will cross-link the antibodies. Your body, those of you who have hay fever, is inappropriately making IgE antibodies against grass pollen, mistaking it to be a parasite, okay? So that's a bit of a war of aggression set up for defensive purposes. These are the consequences, of course, if you eat peanut. This is a child with swollen hands and hives, severe inflammation. The whole face can become distorted. The tongue can become swollen. The throat can close up. Or you can develop very severe asthma and sometimes life-threatening asthma. In older children and adults, you can actually get cardiac shock and a drop in blood pressure. And unfortunately, food allergy can result in fatalities. And in fact, the quality of life for the 8% of children, now 8% of primary school children will have had food allergies. It's almost getting to an epidemic of 1 in 10. those children don't know whether their next reaction is going to be mild or life-threatening. So it really is like living with a sword of Damocles hanging, above you, not knowing, and quality of life really becomes impaired. Walking around restaurants, going to cafes, going on holiday, staying at hotels, eating at your friends or home even is an issue. How do we diagnose this? Well, we do skin prick tests, and if the lighting is not very good, you put a solution of the substance or a piece of the food on the skin, you prick it, the mast cells release histamine, and you get a little bubble or hive or welt or wheal on the skin surrounded by redness. And that welt is an indication, not conclusive proof, but an indication of allergy. You can also measure those allergic antibodies I mentioned, called Ig antibodies, that are specific for either peanut or for egg or for milk or for pollen in the skin. And the ultimate gold standard test is what we call a food challenge, where if you've got the blood testing, skin testing, and history are not clear, okay, because usually the history is very clear. Child ate peanut butter for the first time, within minutes face swelled up, but sometimes the history is less clear. Child ate an unknown food, salad dressing, no one knows what the ingredients were, 45 minutes later developed some breathing difficulties. Was this related to the food or not? You do the blood testing, you do the skin testing, and when in doubt, you do a food challenge. The best way of doing this, and we certainly do that in research settings, is what's called a double-blind, placebo-controlled food challenges, and that's because we are all suggestible. The patients are suggestible because of anxiety, and they may start to get tingling of their mouth merely due to anxiety, or the doctors are suggestible either because they think the child does have food allergy and may overinterpret a small blemish on the skin, or underinterpret something if they think the child doesn't have food allergies. So if let's say the suspected food is peanut, they will get the dose interspersed, peanut interspersed with a placebo, and it's disguised in a way that the child can't taste it, and the child doesn't know which dose he's receiving, nor does the doctor. And in a double-blind placebo-controlled challenge, you would expect to see a typical allergic reaction, the sort of pictures I showed you, though to a lesser extent, occurring after the real verum dose and not the placebo dose. So how are food allergies set up? And my group, myself and my colleagues, started working on the dual-allergen exposure hypothesis. Actually, and it was an idea that was sort of in the back of my mind, that actually was very much stimulated by animal model work and what my patients told me. But my number one lesson as a doctor is, well, actually it should be the number one lesson in medical school, is always listen to your patients. And one tends to forget that as a doctor when one thinks one knows everything, but that's not the case. And usually it's our patients who come up with the best ideas. So the idea of the dual-allergen exposure hypothesis is that in babies with broken down skin with eczema, and in fact, the children who develop food allergies are babies who've had eczema. Everyone thinks it's food allergies that cause eczema, but actually it seems to be the reverse. Eczema starts in the first few months of life. There's now a gene that has been identified with eczema called filaggrin, and there's a mutation in that gene, and you don't produce enough of filaggrin, which is the cement that binds the paving stones of the skin together. As a consequence, you lose water, the skin becomes inflamed, dry, but at a molecular level, it's like having microscopic holes in the skin. And the skin is like the walls around a castle or fortress. It's the main barrier of the immune system to foreign parasites and infectious organisms coming in. And when that breaks down, little molecules of peanut or milk or wheat floating around the home, or father eats a peanut butter sandwich on his way to work, kisses his child with eczema on the cheek, millions of molecules penetrate through the skin, which wouldn't be the case in a normally intact skin. And the immune system sees this as an invading parasite, because foods shouldn't normally enter through the skin, parasites do, and it mounts through specialized arm of the immune system, what are called Th2 memory T cells, which stimulate IgE production, these nasty molecules towards the foods that have penetrated through the skin. So that's how we believe food allergies now are set up. How do you become tolerant? Tolerant is not just a passive state. Tolerant is actively being able to recognize that food, learning that that food is innocuous, and actually mounting a tolerant response. And I'm not going to go into the mechanisms of that tolerant response that are poorly understood, but it's active. Just the way, you would be wary of someone who was walking around your house unless you'd been introduced to them before, okay? You need introduction in order to trust someone. That's an active process. And the analogy I use is this one, okay? So if the chap who opens a door here is the immune system, okay? And people come in through the door, which is the gastrointestinal tract, okay? That's a normal way that foods would enter the body, and we would tolerate those foods. And your friends, if they enter through the front door, will generally be quite welcome, especially if they're bringing champagne and flowers. But if your friends sort of, I don't know, decide one evening to be a bit odd and dress up and break through your window, you're going to attack them. So it's all about to do with routes of exposure. If food molecules are entering your gut, you see them as a good thing, you tolerate them. They enter through your skin, you see them as a bad thing. And going back to this dual exposure, it's all about whether you become tolerant as an infant or allergic depends on the relative balance of the routes of exposure. And the theory would be that if you feed a baby the foods very early on, contrary to what we've been saying for many decades, but if you feed the food very early on, the immune system will acquire tolerance, recognize this as innocuous, and then you will have an active state of tolerance, and that will prevent allergies. Whereas, if the baby is avoiding foods, but everyone in the family is eating peanuts and eggs and milk around the baby, and the baby has eczema, then the sole route of exposure is through the skin. And the body sees that as an enemy or invading parasite, and allergies set up. So it's all to do with the relative timing and quantities of routes of exposure, we believe. In fact, when I was working in Denver many years ago, I was working on an animal model, a mouse model of asthma and egg allergy. And one of the really curious things, in fact, the first person who ever showed this was H.G. Wells, who was a researcher as well as being an eminent writer, was that if you fed guinea pigs, and here in this experiment, mice, ovalbumin, which is the major protein of egg, or one of the major proteins, as a baby, as a mouse pup, as a baby, it was almost impossible to then make the mouse allergic to egg in the future. That phenomenon is called oral tolerance induction. So we've known about this in mice long before we've really realized this important concept in humans. Whereas if you rub ovalbumin or milk or peanut on the inflamed skin of mice, they develop an IgE allergic response. So we've known about this in animal models for a while. I'm not going to go through the evidence for cutaneous sensitization, but eczema is associated with food allergy. The skin barrier is impaired in children with eczema. We know that. There are microscopic holes. We did show many years ago, together with Jean Golding, that the use, Professor Golding in Bristol, in a large study, that the use of arachis oil products, arachis oil is peanut oil that contains small molecules of peanut protein as well, of hydrophilic peanut proteins. If you use these creams and emollients on the skin, that was a risk for developing peanut allergy. And we know that children who develop peanut allergy have high exposure to peanut in their home environment as babies. What about evidence for oral exposure? And here, when I gave a lecture to a similar, actually quite a larger audience in Israel, in Tel Aviv, about close to 20 years ago, had an audience of pediatricians and allergists. They wanted me to talk about peanut allergy, which we saw a lot of in the UK and in the US. I asked an audience much larger than this, how many of you have seen peanut allergy in the last year? In the UK, every pediatrician and allergist would have put their hand up. Only two or three out of several hundred put their hand up, indicating that either the Israeli doctors didn't know how to diagnose peanut allergy, which was very unlikely, or there really was a lower rate of peanut allergy there. And that didn't make sense to me because I was working in London. I thought, well, could this be a genetic cause? And that didn't make sense because I was working in London, which has a large Jewish population, and I was seeing a lot of peanut allergy in Jewish children. So what we did was a comparative study looking at about 5,000 school children in Israel and the UK, and this was done together with Itzhak Katz in Tel Aviv and my colleague George Dutoy. And what we found was the rate of peanut allergy was tenfold higher in the UK than in and in the UK, we looked specifically at children attending Jewish day schools who shared the same ancestral background as the Israeli children. Why that commonality? Because it means there's a similar, or not identical, but very similar genetic background, and therefore any difference in the disease would be unlikely to be explained on the basis of genes, but more on the basis of environment. And we looked at multiple environmental factors, but the thing that stood out like a sore thumb was in those days we were advocating to prevent peanut allergy, that babies in the first year of life should not be exposed to peanuts if they came from a high-risk family. And we looked at the consumption of infants of peanuts in the UK, which was 0, whereas in Israel it was about 6 grams or 2 grams of peanut protein per week, which is a pretty astronomical dose of peanut for a young baby. So they were, like the mice who were becoming tolerant, the Israelis were applying this through a snack called bamba to their babies there. And it's very interesting that in southwestern Africa, where peanut is really one of the staple foods you give young infants because it's a food rich in calories and protein, you just don't see peanut allergies occurring in those countries. So that was a clue, not evidence. Correlation in science doesn't imply causality. So to put this to the test, we did the LEAP and LEAP-ON studies funded by these bodies, primarily the Immune Tolerance Network in the US, who was sponsored really by the NIH. And together with my with these groups who supported us, and with my colleagues George Dutour and others, we conducted the LEAP study, learning early about peanut allergy. That was a randomized trial of peanut consumption in infants at risk for peanut allergy. Who are the infants at risk? Infants with severe eczema. So we enrolled infants between 4 and 11 months of age with severe eczema, and we screened them, and if they had severe eczema or egg allergy, they were deemed to be at risk of peanut allergy, about a 20% risk. Obviously, we chose an at-risk population so that we would see the disease, so we could actually evaluate prevention of the disease. And we split the children into 2 groups: those who received this Israeli peanut snack or peanut butter or peanut soup, or children who completely avoided it during the first 5 years of life. And then we did the skin testing I showed you, the IgE testing, and the challenges at 5 years of age to see which was the better strategy to prevent peanut allergy, avoidance or consumption. Avoidance was what we'd been really preaching for many decades to prevent allergies. And we found, to our surprise, actually, in these children, a group already had small positive skin prick tests to peanut. The process had started, the immunological ball had started rolling downhill, but these children were not yet peanut allergic. So they were enrolled into the study 2, the group that we call the skin test positive stratum. They were made up of 98 children. Those who had completely negative skin test, that was 542 children. And we looked at the effect in both groups of children. They had to have at least 2 grams of peanut protein at least 3 times a week for the duration of the study. We used peanut butter or peanut soup. This is roughly, in fact, we thought it would be difficult, but they ate it with great gusto, and they were eating, rather than the 6 grams, on average about 7.7 grams per week, which is equivalent to these quantities of the snacks. In order, not that we don't trust patients, but participants in the study very often like to make the doctors feel good and say, yes, of course I'm taking everything, when sometimes, the pills are being chucked down. And so what we did actually was a bit sneakily, though of course we told the families what we were doing. We measured dust we measured peanut proteins in the dust of the babies who were eating peanut, because we know that correlates very well with the infant's consumption, because peanut is a sticky substance. And we found, this is a log scale, so we found a 30-fold higher rate of peanut in the beds of the consumer group compared to the avoider group. So we had objective evidence that there was a real difference between the two groups. And this is what we call an intention to treat analysis on all the children who were evaluated at the end of the study. So out of the 640 children, we were able to evaluate 628. Only 12 children dropped out over, which is about 1% over a 5-year, or actually slightly more than 1% over a 5-year study. So the families were very dedicated. We did food challenges, and the avoidance group is the grey bar. The consumption group is the green bar. And you can see what happened in the skin test negative group, the majority of the children, about 14% had peanut allergy. In the consumption group, that had dropped by about 86%. So we'd been able to prevent peanut allergy in that group by almost 90%. In the group who had small positive skin tests, there were a similar reduction was group, and when you combine the two groups, obviously you get about an average reduction of about 80%. So we were able to switch off or prevent peanut allergy occurring in the majority of these children. There were children who already had, even in the skin test positive in the skin test negative group, about 30% were already making low-level IgE molecules in the blood. So when we looked at the children who weren't making IgE antibodies, they obviously had a lower risk of developing peanut allergy, only a 6% risk in the avoidance group, but a 1% in the consumption group. And these are the different combinations of positive and negative skin tests. Whichever combination you have, you seem to get about an 80% reduction in peanut allergy. One of the reviewers, when we submitted our paper to the New England Journal, one of the reviewers asked us, you know how reviewers, I'm sure some of your scientists around here, you submit a paper and the reviewers come back with these impossible questions, and they asked us to see, well, you know, this may well work for Caucasian or European children, but if this is a policy to be applied in other countries, does it occur for Black African children or Indian children or Chinese or Pakistani? And we thought that was a bit of a daft question because the majority of the population was Caucasian. But London being London, we live in a multicultural, multi-ethnic setting. We were fortunate to have Black, mainly Afro-Caribbean, Asian, mainly Indian and Pakistani, and mixed ethnicity children. And whatever the ethnicity, whether you're mixed, Asian or Black, you saw this great reduction from the grey to the green in all the different groups. And the effect was so large that we were able to get statistical significance across the board. Another really interesting thing you'll notice here, if you avoid peanuts and you are in a high-risk population of Europeans, or Caucasians, I should say, your risk of peanut allergy is 13%. If you're of mixed race, it's 30%, Asian 44%, Black 23%. So if you are non-Caucasian, you've got a much higher risk of peanut allergy, and now there's evidence of other food allergies as well. And the overwhelming paradox, for me it's overwhelming because I really can't understand it, is when you take Black African children or Indian children who are brought up in their ancestral home, they don't have any food allergies at all. Similarly, actually, so why that is, that may have something to do with the hygiene hypothesis, which if someone wants to ask me about afterwards, they can, but there's no time to go into it. But it may have something to do between a mismatch between the evolution of your genes in a particular environment and a new environment. So if you take Caucasian children, okay, where do they have the highest incidence of food allergies? Not in Europe, but in the United States and in Australia. Australia has by far the highest. And again, there's a mismatch between where their ancestors evolved and the new land that they moved to. So that may have something to do with it. A real conundrum. Now, one of the problems or questions was what happens when you stop eating peanuts? Because we know for a lot of treatments or preventative treatments, or even in immunizations against bugs, you need booster vaccines. Did you need to continue eating peanuts forever? So what we decided to do was and in a lot of the reviewers of our proposed second study, which was called Leap On, not a very original name, but that's the one we chose, and we decided that the children would all now, or even the children who were eating peanuts in bucketfuls for the first 5 years, would now completely avoid peanuts for a year, and people didn't believe that children who were accustomed to eating peanuts would so readily give it up, or the families would, but in fact they did. And we did the Leap On study to see whether the protective effects that had been acquired through early peanut consumption were still maintained after a year of complete cessation of peanuts. And this is Leap, which finished at 5 years of age, at 60 months, when we saw this huge protective effect. And then everyone avoided peanuts, both the original avoidance group and the consuming group, for a further year till these children were 6 years or 72 months of age, and they were re-challenged with peanut. This is the end. These are the results at the end of the Leap study, okay, this massive effect, and there's virtually no difference at the end of the Leap On study on the right-hand panel. The numbers have shifted slightly, in fact, 3 children acquired new peanut allergy in the original consuming group, but also 3 children in the avoidance group. So it wasn't actually cessation of consumption that caused that, and you still had a very large protective effect. A minority of children who originally had peanut allergy outgrew their peanut allergy. That does happen in a minority of children with peanut allergy. Unfortunately, generally, the majority of children with peanut allergy become adult peanut allergics individuals. So the protective effect was maintained. So the Leap and Leap On studies together demonstrate that the early introduction of peanut induces unresponsiveness to peanut that persists following 12 months of avoidance. But that gave rise to two further questions. This was in a high-risk population of babies with eczema or egg allergy. What would happen if you did this to a general population? We saw that it worked in children who are Asian or black or European, but what would happen in children without eczema? And would this strategy work not only for peanut, but could we prevent all food allergies using this strategy? And hence the EAT study, inquiring about tolerance, was born. And the EAT study, funded largely by the Food Standards Agency, but also the Medical Research Council and other agencies, enrolled, and these are my co-investigators, who I must thank, Michael Perkin and many others who worked tirelessly in this study. Both Leap and Leap On studies were very big studies, large numbers of patients, large number of staff working on them. Very expensive studies because you're following children for 5, 6, 7 years. Not like the good old days in Denver where I was doing mouse studies, which lasted about a month. This was a randomized trial of introduction of allergenic foods in breastfed infants. And you all know the WHO guidelines are that babies should be exclusively breastfed for 6 months of age, and that solid foods, alternative supplementary foods, should not be introduced till after 6 months of age. And in most countries, the weaning process is a very gradual one. One new food at a time every 3 days, delay the allergenic foods like egg and peanut till after a year of age, etc. So we decided to compare the idea that was to test the hypothesis that introduction of 6 allergenic foods, those foods I showed you earlier, milk, egg, peanut, sesame, fish, and wheat, from 3 months of age, while the infant was breastfeeding, but early introduction would protect or not protect, and to compare that alongside a group that was exclusively breastfed for the first 6 months a la WHO guidelines. So we had 1,300 children who, again, very much a la Leap, were randomized into 2 groups. The standard introduction group, so babies were enrolled at 3 months of age. The criteria was mothers had to have exclusively breastfed their babies, not 1 bottle of milk, then the babies couldn't participate in the study. And at 3 months of age, these children were randomized to either continue WHO guidelines or to introduce egg, milk, fish, peanut, wheat, and sesame very early on in substantial quantities. We followed these children up to the age of 3, and using similar methodology to LEAP, challenges, skin test, IgE, we determined the presence of food allergy or tolerance. Now, one big concern, and we came under heavy criticism for this study, and justifiable concern, was that we know that when babies are breastfeeding and you start to give them bottles very early on, the breastfeeding stops, the breastfeeding supply switches off, and breastfeeding ceases, and there's no doubt that breastfeeding has huge benefits. But so if you looked at exclusive breastfeeding, well, not surprisingly, there was a big divergence between the two groups because that's what we sought to achieve. But if you looked at any breastfeeding, breastfeeding continued all the way up to 12 months of age in the infants to the same extent in both groups. So we were not switching off breastfeeding by the early introduction of solids, which was a big concern that a lot of people had that we might be inducing. We introduced always milk first in the form of yogurt, milk protein in the form of yogurt. We also introduced wheat right at the end because of the potential concern about celiac disease. And then in between, this was over the first 6 weeks of the study, the 6 foods were introduced. This is week 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then 6. And first was always cow's milk, 6 was always wheat, and then we randomly interspersed the other 4 foods so that there wouldn't be an order effect. And we then looked at consumption. We assessed number of grams per week. Purple is good, okay, and pink is not so good, and this is as weeks of the study progress on the x-axis on the bottom, and as you move to the right for each food, you see the purple bar increasing, but children didn't like hard-boiled eggs very much. You can see the purple bar is quite small, and the levels of food we wanted to achieve, 3 grams of each food protein per week, were only achieved in a minority of children. And to have followed the protocol for per protocol analysis, but per protocol, that means you adhered to what you were asked to do, and you actually took up the recommended treatment in the early introduction group. They had to, both groups had to have exclusive breastfeeding for 3 months and continued breastfeeding for up to 5 months. But in the early introduction group, if you look at the bottom, they had to have 5 or more of these 6 foods on at least 75% of the recommended amount, which was 3 grams of each food protein per week on 5 or more weeks between 3 and 6 months. You don't need to remember all the details, but just remember it's a hard ask. You're asking 6 foods, lots of protein content very frequently, 4, 6 different foods on a regular basis. And in fact, when it came to the early introduction group, only 43% were able to actually meet that standard. With the standard introduction group, which was exclusive breastfeeding, mothers found it quite easy, and 92% adhered. But early introduction of many foods was not that easy. So that was a problem with our study, okay, because we couldn't achieve quite what we wanted to in more than half the children. However, when you looked at each individual food, there the population fared better. So milk was very easy, and the desired amounts were achieved in 85% of children. Peanut was very popular, as it was in LEAP, 62%, fish 60%. Wheat was, actually you would think babies love pasta, which they do, but this is an artifact because wheat was the last food introduced, and you're counting the number of weeks between 3 and 6 months of age, so you've got fewer weeks left available for wheat. But egg was simply very unpopular. Babies don't like hard-boiled egg. They would have preferred soft-boiled eggs, but of course everyone is terrified about salmonella. This was the outcome, and the final outcome was the prevalence of allergy to at least one of the 6 foods in both groups. And we were disappointed. When you looked at the whole population, the intention to treat population who were valuable, you found a 20% reduction. That's in the ITT population, which was not statistically significant. By not statistically significant, we mean that 20% decrease could have been due to the study intervention, but it could have been due to chance alone. Okay? If you flip a coin 10 times, it won't come down 5 times on heads, 5 times on tails. It might be 4 and 6. That doesn't mean the coin is loaded. It may just mean that this is chance alone. And this difference could have been due to chance alone, whereas in LEAP it clearly wasn't. However, when you look at the children, the 42% of children who achieved the protocol definition and did what they were meant to do, you got a 67% reduction, which is actually a very marked reduction in the overall rate of food allergy. Okay? So you could say, well, that means if you do what the doctors tell you in the research trial, you'll do well. But of course, it could mean something very different. It could mean that the children who didn't manage to adhere were a different group of children. Perhaps they already had very mild forms of allergy, which was preventing them from enjoying and eating the food. So there's always reverse causality, and interpreting a per protocol analysis is much more difficult than interpreting an overall population analysis. So much as we were excited by the per protocol findings, they do need to be interpreted with a bit of a note of caution. If you looked at peanut and egg allergy, the results were much more dramatic than you looked at overall food allergies. And there, even in the intention to treat group for peanut and for egg, you're getting close to statistical significance in the whole population, but not quite. Now, we found that adherence was poor, as opposed to the LEAP study where we were doing one food. Here adherence was poor, and we looked at the factors that dominated poor adherence. And actually, very surprisingly, we found that if you were of non-white ethnicity, it was much harder to introduce these foods earlier on. And we looked for a variety of factors to explain this. Demographics, where you lived, no explanation for this other than ethnicity. Now, there may be cultural differences here in how foods are introduced. It may have something to do with family support, in that people who've moved from other countries may have a less extended family around to help. And we do know that actually if you had more siblings in the family, it was difficult to do this. You need to spend a lot of time and attention doing this. And if you have a smaller family support, it might not be as easy. We don't have a good reason at the moment as to why. But if you think about this, if you want to prevent food allergies in the non-Caucasian population in London, this population suffers a sort of double hit. First of all, we saw genetically they're predisposed to more allergies. Secondly, it's harder to institute a prevention policy, and we're really going to have to think about how to do this, and we're trying to analyze now further some of these factors that determine whether it's easy or difficult to introduce foods into a baby's diet. There were other things as well. So perception of food, this was, to me, is fascinating. One of the things we're analyzing, very often the child had constipation or irritability or fever, and because of the culture we've grown up in, parents immediately interpreted that symptom as being due to the last food that the child had eaten, and then took the child out of the diet. And this fear of foods in my mind, leads to a failure to take up the food, which leads to a self-fulfilling prophecy, which is namely the allergy itself. And you all know the saying, there's nothing to fear but fear itself. And it's the fear of introduction of the foods that I think in many cases leads to a failure to acquire tolerance. I do think we do live, and this relates to other areas of food, health, and disease as well, but we do live in a culture of fear of foods. I think that was part of the problem. So if baby had an exacerbation of eczema, well, we all know that food allergies cause eczema. That's not the case at all, as I said to you earlier. But if the baby had an exacerbation of eczema, well, it must be due to the milk or the wheat that was introduced 4 weeks ago. And then the milk or wheat is pulled out of the diet, and the child becomes allergic. No deaths, it sounds like it's a pretty major thing. We were very lucky because in a large population some deaths can occur, And there were 3 life-threatening events. Those could have been anything from infection, but they actually all occurred in the standard group, not in the early introduction group. So, and no significant differences in rates of hospitalization or anaphylaxis. So we knew we were not inducing damage in this population. Rates of growth were identical. We weren't inducing obesity or failure to grow. One of the concerns that has been touted is that introducing foods too early on in life, complementary foods in addition to breastfeeding, may lead to obesity. That clearly was not the case. And the EAT study conclusions are that the intention to treat analysis revealed a 20% reduction. That was not significant, but the per protocol analysis, the children who actually did what they were meant to do, had a marked reduction. Breastfeeding rates were not negatively affected. There was a 75% reduction in egg allergy in the early introduction group and 100% reduction in peanut allergy. I showed you before. Those were quite significant effects. In this, remember, this is a non-atopic population, children who, all comers, but the majority didn't have eczema, unlike the LEAP study. And we did, but I'd say here at the bottom, we need to interpret the results of this with caution, because a large number of children didn't adhere in the study. An editorial was written about this study in the New England. I very liked the comment that the review of our study made, and he said, in the meantime, evidence is building that early consumption rather than delayed introduction of food is likely to be more beneficial as a strategy for the primary prevention of food allergy. So feed your children and hope that they will eat. You remember when you were children resisting the greens and the vegetables? Well, this is the same sort of problem. But I think it will be possible to introduce allergenic foods more rapidly in infants' diets and wean them more rapidly. But I think it's very much a matter of culture and finding out how to do it. At the moment, we very much evolved into a society that delays food introduction, and we give these very bland, hypoallergenic foods to babies. But I think, if you look in, and it's very interesting, though, because the ethnicities that were finding it difficult to introduce these foods, when, as I said, in Ghana, they're giving peanuts to babies of 3 months of age, not whole peanuts, of course, and dried fish and other things as well. So there are ways of doing it. We simply need to learn the techniques. I thank you, the audience, for your attention. Hope I haven't put you too much to sleep. And I finally thank, most importantly, the almost 2,000 participants, the families and their children, who really contributed so much to these studies. And I'm happy to take any questions, should there be any.